Why is it that when we look at our lives and the world around us, we constantly ask, is this all there is? If this is it and all that there ever has been, why bother even asking the question? It should be instinctively self-evident for us, but for some reason it isn't. To say that this life is all there is to deny a fundamental question in us all that never ceases to go away. Is there more to life than just this world?
If this life is all there is, we will die and be forgotten, and in time, all we have affected will be forgotten as well. One day, all of mankind's achievements will crumble to dust, and life will be extinguished as the last stars fade into blackness. If this life is all there is, purpose has no purpose, and meaning no meaning. But we have been sold a lie. This material existence is not all there is. This universe was not created from itself, but from something, someone, beyond space and time. This material world is derived from the immaterial, and beyond it, there is another world waiting for us, a better world.
Is it rational to believe in God? Many people think that faith and reason are opposites, that belief in God and tough-minded logical reasoning are like oil and water. They are wrong. Belief in God is far more rational than atheism. Logic can show that there is a God. If you look at the universe with common sense and an open mind, you'll find that it's full of God's fingerprints. A good place to start is with an argument by Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century philosopher and theologian. The argument starts with the not very startling observation that things move. But nothing moves for no reason. Something must cause that movement. And whatever caused that must be caused by something else, and so on. But this causal chain cannot go backwards forever. It must have a beginning. There must be an unmoved mover to begin all the motion in the universe, a first domino to start the whole chain moving, since mere matter never moves itself. A modern objection to this argument is that some movements in quantum mechanics, radioactive decay, for example, have no discernible cause. But hang on a second. Just because scientists don't see a cause doesn't mean there isn't one. It just means science hasn't found it yet. Maybe someday they will. But then there will have to be a new cause to explain that one, and so on and so on. But science will never find the first cause. That's no knock on science. It simply means that a first cause lies outside the realm of science. Another way to explain this argument is that everything that begins must have a cause. Nothing can come from nothing. So if there's no first cause, there can't be second causes, or anything at all. In other words, if there's no creator, there can't be a universe. But what if the universe were infinitely old, you might ask? Well, all scientists today agree that the universe is not infinitely old.
Sometimes we're asked the question, can we prove the existence of God? And, it's a strange idea because in one sense, there's a moral intuition that something exists. Like Immanuel Kant talked about two great realities that basically inspired him, the starry heavens above, the moral law within. So there was a basic awareness. And I remember that even as a child, I didn't overtly believe in a God that I followed, but I believed that there was a God out there. It was almost like there was some sense. So can we prove that God exists? I think there are evidential trails, but not proof in the sense of a mathematical proof like 2 + 2 = 4. I think what we use is a sense of arguments that look for what we call the argument towards the best fit. Cumulative case arguments. So we look at various things like in a murder case or a case trying to prove the issue of the guilt of someone in a crime. You have to gather evidence from many different pieces, and the cumulative case argument adds up. In that sense, I think we can point towards the existence of God, the probabilities, but it's not the same as a mathematical proof.
What do we mean when we say prove? Everyone should have a certain level of certainty that they're looking for, and 100% certainty is just out of the question. We can't be 100% certain that we even exist. We can't have 100% certainty that we're even here when we're talking from a philosophical standpoint. So the question is, how much certainty are you willing to have before you act or believe something? And that's what we need to come up with, thresholds of certainty. What is the most coherent explanation? What's the best explanation for the world around us? And if we look at it from that perspective, as we do everything in life, then we can have very good reason to believe that God exists.
When's the last time you walked into a library and asked, hey, where are all the books that have been written by mindless products of natural laws? The librarian would probably laugh at you and tell you that no such books exist. They don't exist because they can't exist. Why not? Because first of all, it's just common sense. The words that form the message in books always originate from a person with a brain. Or to say it a bit more scientifically, the message of the book, the purpose, comes to be understood by the orderly placement of the words, design, and information. Information. Now, anytime we find info, these basic laws always apply. Number one, matter doesn't spontaneously produce source information, and number 2, only a mental source, intelligence can generate new creative information. In other words, just like those books that couldn't originate without a mind, neither could life. Why not, you ask? Because we know that DNA contains information. Therefore, the laws of information science apply, which means the information in DNA couldn't have spontaneously generated, and that a mind is behind the information. Period. No exceptions. Look at it this way. The simplest life form we know of is an amoeba, and it contains as much information in its DNA as 1,000 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. So, are we to believe that there's no way a message in a library book could spontaneously generate, but far more complicated messages in DNA that contain 1,000 times more information could have? Not likely.
Which is required in the protein in this particular place. In fact, it's always another thing to talk about to show you how chance is not enough to produce things, but because I said natural selection won't work, so you have only got chance. And let's see what sort of chance we have. And let's make it as generous as possible for the evolutionists here. If they estimate 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe, that's 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's the number of atoms in the entire universe. And if you say 1 trillion atomic interactions per second, 10 to the power 12, and 10 to the power 18 seconds in the universe, if you believe the Big Bang is true, which I don't, of course, that's the 15 billion years. Now that means that there are 10 to the power of 110 interactions possible. That's 1 followed by 110 zeros. That's the total, the maximum number of interaction between atoms that are possible, even if you grant the entire universe was participating, even if you grant that it's as old as the Big Bang as say it is. There are 20 amino acid letters, and if I'm saying there are 256 enzymes for the simplest life, and that's, I think, very doubtful. I think it's going to be far more complicated. I think this is far too simple, as I mentioned before. Now, each of these enzymes is composed of lots of amino acids. Now, there might be some leeway in some of the amino acids, but I said there are certain ones which can't be chained because they have to be in that right shape for the reaction to occur. So I'm just being generous to say that only 10 of them have to be exactly right. But when you work it out, you find that there's one chance in 10 to the power of about 3,000 to get the right sequence for life. Now, when you think of you've got a bank card, you've got a PIN, you know, I hate the term PIN number. I mean, it's PIN, isn't it, right? Personal identification number is ridiculous. Okay, so you've got a 4-digit PIN, and you're not supposed to leave it lying around there. You're not supposed to have it written down. And the point is, if someone else steals your card and gets us the right PIN, the bank's going to say that you left it lying around somewhere. Because it's 1 in 10,000 chance, or 3 in 10,000, you've got 3 goes of getting it right. 3 in 10,000 chance of getting it right. And the bank thinks that's enough protection for you. But here, it's like getting a 3,000-digit PIN number. See, if a 4-digit PIN number is pretty good protection for the ordinary person using a credit card, well, what's a 3,000-digit PIN number like? It's totally impossible. And when I say 10 amino acids must be the same, well, that's incredibly generous because you've got plenty of proteins like calmodulin where 142 out of the 143 amino acids must be exactly right. And to try and get that by time and chance is just amazing. Just that one protein alone, the chance of getting that is about 1 followed by 185 zeros, just for that one protein, which is essential for metabolizing calcium.
How far the Earth is from the Sun? It seems to be just the perfect distance. How far is the Moon from the Earth? It seems to be just the perfect distance for life to begin existing. Where exactly are we in our galaxy? Our galaxy is the Milky Way. We happen to find ourselves in just the right place for just the right amount of radiation to allow life to exist. Where are we in our solar system? It turns out we're being shielded by an asteroid belt, something we would need in order for life to exist. Gravity has a wide range of constants where it could have been. It could have been one way, it could have been an entirely different way. And in fact, if we took the entire range of constants where gravity could have been set, and we turned that range into a ruler that expands the length of the universe, and we divide that up in 1-inch increments. So we're talking about a ruler, the length of the universe at 1-inch increments. Gravity is exactly where it needs to be in order for life to exist. If it were 1 inch one way, everything would explode. If it were 1 inch the other way, everything would implode. We're talking about gravity could have been anywhere on that ruler, this cosmic ruler.
I think the beauty of art, the beauty of, say, the Grand Canyon of the Swiss mountains, or the intricacies of nature, including the way that everything holds together to sustain and validate life or sustain life, are so complex that, to me, I just cannot accept that that could be purely random chance and necessity. I really, that takes more faith in my mind than to believe that there's a cosmic intelligence with goodness, power, and grace who designed something in which people made in his image could live.
What the intelligent design movement is saying is that we can identify messages in the world around us. We have the ability to say, okay, this message right here has come from an intelligent mind. Then we take what we've learned, we apply it to the world around us, and we say, wow, this world is the product of a mind. This isn't smuggling theism through the back door. This is just a fact. If we can determine that a mind is involved, and we see that a mind is involved in the universe around us, that's the conclusion. And we should take our conclusions and run with them, not try to predetermine what our conclusions should be. That's bad science.
Who created God?
Yeah, I hear that one a lot, and actually just the question assumes something about the word God which no Christian or believer in God, as far as I'm aware, actually thinks. It's a bit like asking, how do you make a square circle? It just misunderstands the meaning of the word God. The word God doesn't mean created being. So as such, to ask who created God is to ask a bit of a nonsense. It is like, how do you make a square circle, and how does that work? Because of course you cannot create a God. That's just not what God means to a Christian or to a theist. And actually, God by definition means an uncreated, infinite ground of all being. And so to say who created God, I think is just to misunderstand what Christians mean by the word God. Nobody believes that in a created God, or no Christians do anyway. Nobody believes that we worship a God who has been created by somebody else or something more powerful. The Christian belief is we worship a God who has always been, who is infinite, who is outside of our comprehension, understanding, and has only made himself accessible to us by becoming like us and revealing himself to us. So we don't believe in a created God, and as such, the question doesn't really, with the greatest respect, make sense from a Christian perspective as to what the word God means.
Only a Trinitarian God can account for the unique attributes that make God who he is. First, let me start by saying that the doctrine of the Trinity begins with the belief that the true God is not totally comprehensible. Any God we could fully understand and explain, like a Unitarian God, would be an entity that is no greater than what we are. A Unitarian once told me that God was just a spirit. Well, if God is just a spirit, he would be no greater than the angels, since that is all the angels are. Lucifer may have had a chance in the war in heaven if God was just a Unitarian spirit, because God would be on the same level as Lucifer. But God created the angels, so he must be more than just a spirit. So how can we learn who God is? By simply studying his attributes. Every monotheistic religion claims that God is omniscient. Well, if God knows all, then he must be able to see everything. And if God sees everything, then he must be everywhere at once, which would make God omnipresent. Now, if God is omnipresent, he would have to be greater than 3 dimensions, because 3-dimensional beings and anything in the 3rd dimension cannot be omnipresent. Therefore, for God to be omnipresent, he must be comprised of more than 3 spatial dimensions. Now, I'm not making this idea up. There are more spatial dimensions than the 3 we live in. At the end of the 19th century, they discovered the concept of hyperdimensions, which are realms that consist of more spatial dimensions than 3. If God is omnipresent, he would have to consist of more than 3 dimensions and be hyperdimensional. How many dimensions does God consist of? Well, if you're going to take the Bible's word, then he is infinitely dimensional. Isaiah 40:28 says, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding." So what does God being hyperdimensional have to do with the Trinity? Well, allow me to explain. Hyperdimensions are not going to make sense to our finite minds. However, luckily, we can explain this using the example of taking a cube and trying to translate it into a 2-dimensional world. Take a look at this cube. Because we understand 3 dimensions, we understand the spatial parameters of this cube. But if we were to encounter a being living in a 2-dimensional world, he wouldn't understand this cube at all. He would look at it and see it as just a square. We could then try to show him that it is actually a cube by turning it to show him another side. But his mind could not comprehend changes made in 3-dimensional space. So to him, the change would look like this: the green square disappearing and the red square appearing. The 2-dimensional being would then say, "Hey, that's a different cube." We would say, "No, it's still the same cube." He would say, "No, that can't be right, because I see a different square." And we would say, "Well, yeah, it's a different square, but it's still part of the same cube." We could then show him all sides of the cube and tell him that all 6 squares he saw were all one cube. Yet all he would see is 6 squares disappearing and appearing before him. He would not see the cube rotating from one side to the other, so he would not see the cube in its entirety or be able to imagine the physics and the shape of the cube, because it exists in a higher dimension than he does. All he could do is trust our word that the 6 separate squares he saw were actually part of one object called a cube. So is this starting to sound familiar? This is exactly the same way God tries to explain himself to us. Clearly, he is omnipresent, meaning he is hyperdimensional and beyond 3 dimensions and beyond our spatial understandings. So God is explaining his form to us in hyperdimensional terms, where the physics allow beings to be more than one person. Yet we are still thinking in terms of 3-dimensional laws, where all beings must only be one person. But since God is beyond the 3rd dimension, he would have to be greater than it, meaning it would only make sense for him to be more than a Unitarian being, like we are. Now, how monumental is this? Well, 2,000 years ago, they didn't have the science of hyperdimensions like we do today. So they came up with the term Trinity to try to explain to the world what God had told us about himself. This is absolutely monumental, because when man makes up a religion, he makes up a God he can understand and make sense of. Only in the Bible do we see a God that is beyond 3 dimensions and beyond the understanding capacity of humans. A hyperdimensional idea that was unknown to people 2,000 years ago. This is why I came to understand that other monotheistic religions have an illogical view of God. When you actually take the time to evaluate the idea of God, only the God of the Bible makes sense. So now this brings up another question. If you're watching this and believe in a Unitarian God, you might be asking, well, why is God only 3 persons? Why not 5, or 10, or 1,000,000 persons? Well, the answer is simple. He is revealed as 3 persons for our sake. 3 is all that is needed for God to show us that He is everything we need. First, He is the Father, God who sits on the throne in heaven, holding the universe in His hands and watching over us from above. He is also revealed as the Holy Spirit. This is how God shows us He is always with us, surrounding us with His love and guiding us with His words, wisdom, and power. Last, God is manifested as Jesus Christ, God who became flesh to demonstrate His love for us by dying for our sins. Jesus is God who suffered in all our human struggles and manifested His love through action by dying on the cross. God is our Father, our guiding presence who is always with us, and our brother, who suffered for our sins and saved us with His love. So unlike the Trinity, a Unitarian God cannot be a God that is all we need. A Trinitarian God is all those things, and therefore everything we could need. In conclusion, all monotheistic religions claim there is only one God, but only the God of the Bible can account for the unique attributes of God. For God to be omnipresent, He must be hyperdimensional. Religions that have a Unitarian view of God worship a God that cannot be omnipresent, and therefore not omnipotent. Only in the Bible do we see a God that is worthy of our praise and worship, and can account for the unique attributes that make God who He is.
Now this one I've heard quite a bit. The fossil record speaks for itself and it proves evolution. Really? Well, first of all, evidence like the fossil record doesn't speak for itself. It's interpreted through a person's worldview, like looking through a lens. We all have the same evidence in the present, the same rock layers, the same fossils, etc., and we interpret this evidence in regard to the past through the lens, or worldview we use. An evolutionist will interpret the evidence through the lens of what he's been taught about evolution in millions of years, but a biblical creationist will interpret the same fossils differently through the lens of the Bible. Now, both are looking at the same evidence in the present, but both are interpreting it very differently. So looking at the fossil record in the present, because that's all we have, and interpreting it through the lens of God's Word, we find that what we actually observe in the present confirms the interpretation obtained by looking through the lens of the Bible. Now, the only meaningful place to start is with the word of someone who has seen everything from the beginning and told us exactly what happened. That someone is God, who has given us a written account of the world's true history in the Bible. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth."
Now, God's written word tells us that during creation week, God created different kinds of animals and plants according to their kinds.
The implication is that they will produce after their kind. That's exactly what we see today, isn't it? An elephant produces an elephant, a dog produces a dog, and on and on. Now on the 6th day, man and woman, Adam and Eve, were also created, and God declared everything very good. It was complete and perfect, and there was no death because there was no sin. Later on in Genesis chapter 3, it is revealed that the man and woman, being tempted by the serpent, rebelled against God, broke His command, and sin and corruption entered the world. In fact, the entire creation was altered and is no longer in its originally perfect, very good state. People and animals began to die. But could gradual death in such a short period of time account for the fossil record we observe today? Not only that, to form a fossil, the animal or plant has to be covered quickly. And since we find billions of fossils all over the world today, something that could have killed billions of things rather quickly had to have occurred. Not to mention, we also find many fish and other marine fossils at the tops of today's mountains. So, what in the Bible could account for that? What could cause billions of dead things to be buried in rock layers rapidly laid down by water all over the earth? Well, flip to Genesis chapter 6 through 9 and you'll read the account of the global flood in Noah's day. Essentially what happened is that men were so corrupt and violent that God selected a righteous man, Noah, and his family to build a huge ark and get in it along with a pair of each land animal kind. And then God caused a worldwide flood. The water gushed up from the ground, and water fell from the sky. The earth was totally covered with water, and all land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures outside the ark were killed. All of them. It was a massive and destructive event. After more than a year, the waters had subsided enough that Noah and his family and the animals could get off the ark. Now, what would a worldwide flood do to the earth? Well, far too many things to discuss here, but it would have definitely totally changed the earth's terrain. It would have tossed things all around, and it would have destroyed billions of plants and animals, burying them all over the earth.
So, based on the biblical worldview, we know that God created everything and it was perfect. But because of man's rebellion, people became corrupt, and all kinds of things began to suffer and die. Because of man's continual violence and corruption, God destroyed all people and all other land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures in the world, save Noah, his family, and representatives of all land-dwelling, air-breathing animal kinds, with a global, catastrophic deluge. The fossil record that we observe today makes perfect sense within the biblical world. Lots of people say there's no way that 2 of every known species in the world could fit onto Noah's Ark. You know what? We agree. But the truth of the matter is that the Bible doesn't claim that's what happened. So if we really want to get to the truth of it, we're going to need to see what the Bible really says about all this and then ask 3 questions. How many animals are we really talking about? How big were they? And how big was the ark? We answer those, we're closer to understanding the truth. Make sense? Good. So how many animals are we really talking about here? Well, let's jump back to move forward, shall we? Let's take a peek at day 5 of Creation Week and do a plain reading of Genesis 1 verse 21. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. Jump ahead to Genesis 1:25, day 6, the same day man and woman were created, and here's what we get. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. So there you have a very clear account of the land and sea creatures created by God according to their kinds. Now, take a look at the phrase, according to their kind. What does it mean? Is it the same as species? I don't think so. It's possible that it's closer to what we call families in the typical biology class today, with some exceptions. Keep in mind that species is a man-made definition anyway. Confused? Let me explain. Let's take the dog kind, for example. We'll call the female dog taken on the ark Bingo, because that's the name of my first dog. Okay, from Bingo and her mate, you can get the various species of coyote, wolf, and even domestic dogs like the border collie, Great Dane, poodle, and so on. You get it? The different species we have now could have easily been generated after the flood from the information already present within the parent kind. So kind isn't the same as species at all. And a plain reading of the Bible teaches that Noah only had to take the representatives of the different kinds of land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. You don't believe me? Take a look for yourself. Genesis 6:20, of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. That's as clear as it gets, folks. Simple instructions of what to take and what not to take. And in case we need further understanding of what God meant, he clarifies by telling us what died outside the ark. Genesis 7:22, and in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. Okay, so he's not talking about any sea creatures being on the ark, not the tiniest seahorse or the largest whale, because the last time I checked, they weren't swimming around on dry land. He's also not talking about plant life or single-celled organisms or bacteria. No, only things that have the breath of life in its nostrils and are on dry land. That's great, you say, but how many original kinds of land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures are on the ark? Well, to be quite honest, we weren't there, and I don't have the time for each and every detail, but one leading ark researcher did a whole bunch of calculations and was very generous with the numbers he used. He selected the genus level and found that there are less than 8,000 kinds, or about 16,000 individual animals. So let's just round up to say 30,000 and then call it even. It'll make the math easier anyway. Could 30,000 animals fit on the ark described in Genesis? That's a good question. Glad you asked. To answer it, we have to take a look at 2 more things. The size of the average animal and the size of the ark. Makes sense? Of course it does. Moving on. We can't list every animal, but we've got things from the various bird kinds to the elephant kind, from the various dinosaur kinds to the smallest mammal kinds, and so on and so on and so on. So you take all the young adult animals, because nothing says the animals had to be the oldest and biggest, and you look at all the various sizes we know of today, even from the fossil record, and you do some calculating, you come to the conclusion that the average size of the land animal is actually smaller than a sheep. But let's just use a sheep as the average size for the sake of argument. So now we've got the size of the average animal, a sheep, and we have the maximum number of sheep, 30,000. So are we going to need a bigger boat? Well, let's see how big it really was and if 30,000 sheep could fit on it. Back to the Bible. Genesis 6:15. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Genesis 6:16. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Using what's known as the small cubit, that makes the ark approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and about 45 feet high, with 3 decks, a door, and a window. So this ain't no canoe or a bathtub boat with giraffe heads poking out of it. This is a huge seaworthy vessel. The total available floor space on the ark would have been over 100,000 square feet. The total cubic volume would have been 1,518,000 cubic feet, which is about the capacity of 522 railroad stock cars. So we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, folks. How many sheep can fit into 522 stock cars? Well, just so happens I know the answer. The average double-deck railroad stock car can fit about 240 sheep. Now that's a lot of wool. So 522 stock cars holding 240 sheep-sized animals each gives us the hefty total of 125,280 sheep-sized creatures that could have fit onto the ark. Remember, we only needed to fit 30,000 on it, and 30,000 is almost 2 times the already generous estimate of animals necessary to represent all the species we see today. So it's easy to see that with more realistic numbers, there was plenty of room for cages, food, and even fresh water for the duration of the year-long stay that these animals had to be on the ark. And you know what? Ark researchers have studied this too, and I'll let you look that up. So there you have it. Simple reading in Scripture, simple math, basic science. This fallible claim against the Bible is debunked. Adios. You hear this one a lot. Science has proven evolution, therefore evolution is true. Since evolution is true and Christians don't believe it, then Christians don't believe science and they aren't rational people. Really, let's put that claim to the test. First off, evolution in the sense that things change is evident. No rational person disputes that. Therefore, rational Christians believe it. We can observe change, but evolution in the sense that life came from non-life and then that life began to randomly generate new genetic information and over time it eventually produced humans is something entirely different and something that quite honestly doesn't hold up against science. In other words, evolution in the sense of molecules to man is not scientifically plausible and therefore should not be viewed as scientific fact. Quite honestly, it is in great opposition to science, that is, observational science, the kind of science we can test and repeat and use our five senses to understand. Science demonstrates that over time, living organisms lose genetic information. They don't gain it. That same science demonstrates that life doesn't arise from non-life. Follow along if you would. Fact 1. There is no known observable process by which new genetic information can be added to an organism's genetic code. None. That pretty much refutes evolution right away because there's no way to go from a fish to an amphibian without adding new information, right? If living organisms cannot produce new genetic information, how can anything gradually change into something of higher intelligence or form or complexity? That is, how can anything evolve from an amoeba to a man without adding new genetic information? The answer, of course, is that it can't. Plain and simple. Now, some have speculated and they have imagined all kinds of things and they brought in artists to produce creative renderings based on guesses, and they have been successful in telling a very convincing story that humans evolved from ape-like creatures. But those are just drawings, people. They're just stories. But what we really observe is humans are humans and apes are apes. Now, if fact 1 buried evolutionary thinking deep into the Precambrian soil, this next fact, fact 2, tosses so much sediment on it that not even the greatest team of paleontologists with the latest subterranean gizmo could dig up the remains. Check this out. Never, again, never has it been observed that life can come from non-life. So here are 2 major scientific evidences against evolution. I reiterate for clarity, life has never been observed to come from non-life, and there is no known, observable process by which new genetic information can be added to the genetic code of an organism. So, molecules to man evolution doesn't really make scientific sense. Yet we are all here, and life is all around us in various forms. Although evolution cannot account for this, the Bible can. The Bible reveals that the all-powerful, all-knowing, supernatural God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing, and all life according to its kinds, that is, each with its own set of genetic information. So, again, what the Bible reveals makes sense of what we see and understand. Evolution does not. Enough said.
All good people are appalled by the sufferings of the innocent. When an innocent person is struck by a painful disease, or tortured, or murdered, we naturally feel sadness and helplessness and often rage. Many people have claimed that such suffering is a proof that God does not exist. Their argument goes like this: God is all good and all powerful. Such a God would not permit unnecessary suffering, yet we constantly observe unjust suffering. Therefore, at least one of the premises about God must be false. Either God is not all good, or he is not all powerful, or he just doesn't exist. What's wrong with this argument? First, let's examine what we mean when we say that God would not permit unjust suffering. There are 2 categories of suffering: suffering caused by human beings, which we call moral evils, and suffering caused by nature, for instance, earthquakes or cancer. Free will explains how God could be good and allow moral evil. Because God has given people free will, they are free to behave against God's will. The fact that they do evil does not prove that God is not good. In addition, if there were no God, there would be no absolute standard of good. Every judgment presupposes a standard, and that's true of our moral judgments too. What is our standard for judging evil to be evil? The most we could say about evil, if there were no God, was that we, in our subjective tastes, didn't like it when people did certain things to other people. We wouldn't have a basis for saying an act was bad, only that we didn't like it. So the problem of human evil exists only if God exists. As for natural suffering, that poses what appears to be a more difficult question. We see an innocent child suffer, say from an incurable disease. We complain. Understandable. We don't like it. Understandable. We feel it is wrong, unfair, and shouldn't happen. Understandable. But illogical unless you believe in God. For if you do not believe in God, your subjective feelings are the only basis upon which you can object to natural suffering. Okay, you don't like it, but how is your not liking something evidence for God not existing? Think about it. It's just the opposite. Our judgments of good and evil, natural as well as human, presuppose God as the standard. If there's no God, there's neither good nor evil. There's just nature, doing what it does. If nature is all there is absolutely no need to explain why one person suffers and another doesn't. Unjust suffering is a problem only because we have a sense of what is just and unjust. But where does this sense come from? Certainly not from nature. There's nothing just about nature. Nature is only about survival. What, in other words, does it mean for suffering to be unnecessary or wrong? How is that determined? Against what standard? Your private standard means nothing. My private standard means nothing. We can talk meaningfully about suffering being unnecessary or wrong only if we have an underlying belief that a standard of right and wrong objectively exists. And if that standard really exists, that means there is a God. Moreover, the believer in God has an incomparably easier time than the atheist psychologically, as well as logically, in dealing with the problem of natural suffering. If you accept that a good God exists, it is possible to also believe that this God somehow sets things right, if not in this world, then in the next. For the atheist, on the other hand, no suffering is ever set right. There is no ultimate justice. The bad win and the good suffer. Earthquakes and cancers kill. End of story. Literally. If nature is all there is, how can a sensitive person remain sane in a world in which tsunamis wipe out whole towns, evil men torture and murder innocent victims, and disease attacks people indiscriminately? The answer is, it's not possible.
Why is there no visible proof of God? I believe this is a valid question that atheists bring up. If God was real and if he loved us, why wouldn't he make his presence known? The fact that he hides shows either God doesn't exist or he doesn't love us enough to make himself known to prevent us from going to hell. However, the more I studied this question from a biblical perspective, the more I realized that there is no visible proof of God because he loves us. The fact that God doesn't make himself known empirically shows how much he truly loves us. You should know Jesus already answered this question in the Bible when he gave the parable of the rich man in hell. The rich man asked Abraham to send Lazarus back to warn his brothers of the terrible place he was in. Yet Abraham denied the rich man's request and told him, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." Now at first glance, this doesn't make sense. Why would Abraham deny the rich man's request? Surely if any of us saw a ghost from beyond the grave, who had come back to warn us of the dangers of hell, we would certainly be convinced that God exists and we should submit to him. But what Jesus is saying in this parable is it's not a matter of knowing that God and hell exist. It's a matter of how you feel about God. Let's just say there was visible proof of God. Let's say he sat on his throne in a palace somewhere in the Middle East, and you could go and see he exists and worship him there. Every human would believe in him and accept that he was God, and no one would go to hell, right? Actually, I think the opposite would happen. Everybody would go to hell. Here's the point. If God was a tangible being on the planet, with all his power and glory, you would worship him and be obedient to his laws because you'd be afraid of him and be afraid of being sent to hell for being disobedient. You would only be good because you'd be afraid that God might punish you. Your entire motivation for being good would not be because you love God or were thankful for what he did for you on the cross. You would be good because you would be worried about yourself. In other words, you wouldn't be good for goodness sake or for God's sake. You would be good for your own sake. And that's the problem, because that's the mindset that sends people to hell. When you're only thinking of yourself and only worried about taking care of yourself, you become filled with self-absorption. Fear only makes you think of yourself, and thinking of yourself is what sends you to hell. See, when Jesus came into this world, he taught that salvation meant the opposite. He taught that his salvation was only for people who didn't put themselves first. In Matthew 10:39 he said, "He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." Then in Matthew 25, he gave the parable of the talents, which is a story of servants. 2 go out and serve their king with the money the king gives them. And the third becomes filled with fear and buries the money the king gives him because he's afraid of what the king might do to him. And because the servant is only thinking of himself, he hides the money for his own safety. Thus the king disposes of him, because the servant was self-absorbed. Maybe not in the usual way we think of self-absorption, but nonetheless, he was still self-absorbed. See, in the parable of the rich man in hell, what Abraham is saying back to the rich man is, fear will never work. Sending Lazarus back to warn his brothers of the dangers of hell will only create fear, and fear doesn't get you to stop focusing on yourself. It only makes you think of yourself even more. And if God was a visible being on the planet, you would be utterly filled with fear. You wouldn't change from thinking of yourself to thinking of a relationship with God, or start loving God and loving your fellow man. You would only be thinking of yourself and how to avoid hell. So your actions would change, but your heart wouldn't. It would still be self-absorbed, just in a different way, but still self-absorbed. What changes your heart is learning what God did for you on the cross, knowing the most radical act of love that ever happened, which is when God went willingly to the cross to take our place, even though we didn't deserve it. And where you find that is in reading about Moses and the prophets. When you learn about that and accept it as truth, then your heart begins to change, and you see that even though you deserve hell, God took it upon himself. When you know the love of God, that is when your heart begins to change. Many people have a misconception about the path to heaven. They think it's just living a good life and following all the rules. So if God was real, he should make his presence known, so I'll know that heaven and hell exist and I can follow all of God's commandments. But when people do that, the heart doesn't change. You're still self-absorbed, because your attitude becomes, I'm doing good, I'm working hard, so God has to bless me. And you're only thinking of yourself. You are using your moral deeds to force God to bless you. The only way to change the heart is through a radical transformation of love, and we see that love when we read about Jesus and what he did on the cross. If God was a powerful king on the planet, you wouldn't see the love he gave for you there. All you would see is this mighty king, and you would never know the love he has for you or what he really wanted for you. You would just be filled with fear and self-absorption. Many people have a misconception that God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden because he didn't want to be with them anymore, which is not true. Jesus had Adam and Eve leave the garden because he saw they had become self-absorbed, and they were only thinking of themselves. And in such a state, if they were to stay with God, they would only try to please him and form a relationship with him to see what they could get out of it. Their entire attitude would be, I want to please you, God, not because I love you, but because I love myself and want to be blessed. So because of their new sinful attitude, God had no choice but to make them leave his presence. Not because he didn't want to be with them, but because he knew what the relationship would be with them. And he could not look upon such a relationship. Instead, we needed to see the action of how much he truly loved us before we could begin to escape our self-absorption. Now, in the relationship we have with him, he gives us everything, and in return he asks that we give him everything back. Not because he's selfish, but because he was utterly selfless. He came into our world in weakness and willingly died for you, because he loves you more than you can imagine, and he doesn't want to be in a relationship where you fear him for your own life's sake. He loves you, and he wants you to love him back. So knowing the true nature of your heart and the mindset you would have if he was here visibly, he instead reveals himself in ways that won't assure your damnation.
Here in my side, my hands are holding you.
Can't you lead a good life without believing in Christianity? This is the question on which I've been asked to write. And straight away, before I begin trying to answer it, I have a comment to make. The question sounds as if it were asked by a person who said to himself, I don't care whether Christianity is in fact true or not. I'm not interested in finding out whether the real universe is more like what the Christians say than what the materialists say. All I'm interested in is leading a good life. I'm going to choose beliefs not because I think them true, but because I find them helpful. Now, frankly, I find it hard to sympathize with this state of mind. One of the things that distinguishes man from the other animals is that he wants to know things, wants to find out what reality is like, simply for the sake of knowing. When that desire is completely quenched in anyone, I think he has become something less than human. As a matter of fact, I don't believe any of you have really lost that desire. More probably, foolish preachers, by always telling you how much Christianity will help you and how good it is for society, have actually led you to forget that Christianity is not a patent medicine. Christianity claims to give an account of facts, to tell you what the real universe is like. Its account of the universe may be true, or it may not, and once the question is really before you, then your natural inquisitiveness must make you want to know the answer. If Christianity is untrue, then no honest man will want to believe it, however helpful it might be. If it is true, every honest man will want to believe it, even if it gives him no help at all. As soon as we have realized this, we realize something else. If Christianity should happen to be true, then it is quite impossible that those who know this truth and those who don't should be equally well equipped for leading a good life. Knowledge of the facts must make a difference to one's actions. Suppose you found a man on the point of starvation who wanted to do the right thing. If you had no knowledge of medical science, you would probably give him a large, solid meal, and as a result, your man would die. That is what comes of working in the dark. In the same way, a Christian and a non-Christian may both wish to do good to their fellow men. The one believes that men are going to live forever, that they were created by God, and so built that they can find their true and lasting happiness only by being united to God, that they have gone badly off the rails, and that obedient faith in Christ is the only way back. The other believes that men are an accidental result of the blind workings of matter, that they started as mere animals and have more or less steadily improved, that they are going to live for about 70 years, that their happiness is fully attainable by good social services and political organizations, and that everything else, e.g. vivisection, birth control, the judicial system, education, is to be judged to be good or bad simply insofar as it helps or hinders that kind of happiness. Now, there are quite a lot of things which these two men could agree in doing for their fellow citizens. Both would approve of efficient sewers and hospitals and a healthy diet. But sooner or later, the difference of their beliefs will produce differences in their practical proposals. Both, for example, might be very keen about education, but the kinds of education they wanted people to have would obviously be very different. Again, where the materialist would simply ask about a proposed action, will it increase the happiness of the majority? The Christian might have to say, even if it does increase the happiness of the majority, we can't do it. It is unjust. And all the time, one great difference would run through their whole policy. To the materialist, things like nations, classes, civilizations must be more important than individuals, because the individuals live only 70-odd years each, and the group may last for centuries. But to the Christian, individuals are more important, for they live eternally, and races, civilizations, and the like are, in comparison, the creatures of a day. The Christian and the materialist hold different beliefs about the universe. They can't both be right. The one who is wrong will act in a way which simply doesn't fit the real universe. Consequently, with the best will in the world, he will be helping his fellow creatures to their destruction. With the best will in the world. Then it won't be his fault. Surely God, if there is a God, will not punish a man for honest mistakes. But was that all you were thinking about? Are we ready to run the risk of working in the dark all our lives and doing infinite harm, provided only someone will assure us that our own skins will be safe, that no one will punish us or blame us? I will not believe that the reader is quite on that level. But even if he were, there is something to be said to him. The question before each of us is not, can someone lead a good life without Christianity? The question is, can I? We all know there have been good men who were not Christians. Men like Socrates and Confucius who had never heard of it, or men like J.S. Mill who quite honestly couldn't believe it. Supposing Christianity to be true, these men were in a state of honest ignorance or honest error. If their intentions were as good as I suppose them to have been, for of course I can't read their secret hearts, I hope and believe that the skill and mercy of God will remedy the evils which their ignorance, left to itself, would naturally produce both for them and for those whom they influenced. But the man who asks me, "Can't I lead a good life without believing in Christianity?" is clearly not in the same position. If he hadn't heard of Christianity, he would not be asking this question. If, having heard of it, and having seriously considered it, he had decided that it was untrue, then once more he would not be asking the question. The man who asks this question has heard of Christianity and is by no means certain that it may not be true. He is really asking, need I bother about it? Mayn't I just evade the issue, just let sleeping dogs lie and get on with being good? Aren't good intentions enough to keep me safe and blameless without knocking on that dreadful door and making sure whether there is or isn't someone inside? To such a man, it might be enough to reply that he is really asking to be allowed to get on with being good before he has done his best to discover what good means. But that is not the whole story. We need not inquire whether God will punish him for his cowardice and laziness. They will punish themselves. The man is shirking. He is deliberately trying not to know whether Christianity is true or false, because he foresees endless trouble if it should turn out to be true. He is like the man who deliberately forgets to look at the notice board because, if he did, he might find his name down for some unpleasant duty. He is like the man who won't look at his bank account because he's afraid of what he might find there. He is like the man who won't go to the doctor when he first feels a mysterious pain because he is afraid of what the doctor might tell him. The man who remains an unbeliever for such reasons is not in a state of honest error. He is in a state of dishonest error, and that dishonesty will spread through all his thoughts and actions. A certain shiftiness, a vague worry in the background, a blunting of his whole mental edge will result. He has lost his intellectual virginity. Honest rejection of Christ, however mistaken, will be forgiven and healed. Whosoever shall speak a word against the Son of Man, it shall be forgiven him. But to evade the Son of Man, to look the other way, to pretend you haven't noticed, to become suddenly absorbed in something on the other side of the street, to leave the receiver off the telephone because it might be he who was ringing up, to leave unopened certain letters in a strange handwriting because they might be from him, this is a different matter. You may not be certain yet whether you ought to be a Christian, but you do know you ought to be a man, not an ostrich hiding its head in the sand. But still, for intellectual honor has sunk very low in our age, I hear someone whimpering on with his question, will it help me? Will it make me happy? Do you really think I'd be better if I became a Christian? Well, if you must have it, my answer is yes. But I don't like giving an answer at all at this stage. Here is a door, behind which, according to some people, the secret of the universe is waiting for you. Either that's true, or it isn't. And if it isn't, then what the door really conceals is simply the greatest fraud, the most colossal sell on record. Isn't it obviously the job of every man, that is a man and not a rabbit, to try and to find out which, and then to devote his full energies either to serving this tremendous secret or to exposing and destroying this gigantic humbug? Faced with such an issue, can you really remain wholly absorbed in your own blessed moral development? All right, Christianity will do you good, a great deal more good than you ever wanted or expected. And the first bit of good it will do you is to hammer into your head, you won't enjoy that, the fact that what you have hitherto called good all that about leading a decent life and being kind, isn't quite the magnificent and all-important affair you supposed. It will teach you that in fact you can't be good, not for 24 hours, on your own moral efforts. And then it will teach you that even if you were, you still wouldn't have achieved the purpose for which you were created. Mere morality is not the end of life. You were made for something quite different from that. J.S. Mill and Confucius, Socrates was much nearer the reality, simply didn't know what life is about. The people who keep on asking if they can't lead a decent life without Christ don't know what life is about. If they did, they would know that a decent life is mere machinery compared with the thing we men are really made for. Morality is indispensable, but the divine life, which gives itself to us and which calls us to be gods, intends for us something in which morality will be swallowed up. We are to be remade. All the rabbit in us is to disappear, the worried, conscientious, ethical rabbit, as well as the cowardly and sensual rabbit. We shall bleed and squeal as the handfuls of fur come out. And then, surprisingly, we shall find underneath it all a thing we have never yet imagined. A real man, an ageless God, a son of God, strong, radiant, wise, beautiful, and drenched in joy. When that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. The idea of reaching a good life without Christ is based on a double error. Firstly, we cannot do it, and secondly, in setting up a good life as our final goal, we have missed the very point of our existence. Morality is a mountain which we cannot climb by our own efforts. And if we could, we should only perish in the ice and unbreathable air of the summit, lacking those wings with which the rest of the journey has to be accomplished. For it is from there that the real ascent begins. The ropes and axes are done away, and the rest is a matter of flying.